Hi, welcome to the first lecture on Chapter 8. We're going to be learning about sound, how sound is constructed within a poem, and how the sound of a poem helps us to understand the poem's meaning and its tone, and generally impacts our experience of the poem. As with the figures of speech chapter, there's a lot of vocabulary in Chapter 8, and specifically, there's a long list of different types of rhyme that we will not be working with. I have here the vocabulary that we're going to focus on, and we'll look at these techniques in some sample poems. So we have alliteration, assonance, cacophony, euphony, onomatopoeia, and then we will look at rhyme and specifically at end rhyme. In this lecture, we'll work with all of these techniques except for onomatopoeia, and we won't see an example of cacophony, but we'll come to understand why euphony and not cacophony was employed in the sample poem. So let's take a look at this poem, All Day I Hear by James Joyce. All day I hear. All day I hear the noise of waters making moan, sad as the seabird is when going forth alone. He hears the wind's cry to the water's monotone. The gray winds, the cold winds are blowing where I go. I hear the noise of many waters far below. All day, all night, I hear them flowing to and fro. So let's start out by looking at rhyme. And we're working with end rhyme, so rhymes that occur at the end of a poetic line and not within the line. And you can see right away, waters, moan, going, alone, waters, monotone. You can start to hear the rhyme. So obviously waters is repeated, and that's a rhyme. And then moan, alone, and monotone, also examples of end rhyme. When we get to the second stanza, Joyce picks up the rhyme from going and brings it to the end of this line with blowing, and then again here with flowing. And he's repeated waters, but also introduces another rhyme with go, below, and fro. When you notice where rhyme occurs in a poem, it starts to help you recognize units of sound. And often in poetry, units of sound will help create units of sense. In other words, the sound will contribute to some of the meaning and our understanding of that meaning in the poem. We'll come back to this after we've looked at some more of the sound techniques in Joyce's poem. So let's start with alliteration, and I'll just point out a couple of examples. We see here the repetition of sounds at the beginning of words in making and moan in line 2. We see another example in line 3 with the S sound in sad and seabird. We've mentioned before when we looked at rhyme that waters is repeated, but there's other repetition in the poem, not just waters, but winds. Both of them beginning with W and kind of stretching out a sort of alliteration through the poem, a repetition of sound. And then we also have examples of assonance. Now I want to bounce back up to our book's definition of assonance, the repetition of 2 or more vowel sounds in successive words, which creates a kind of rhyme. And although they limit assonance to successive words, it actually can be created with the repetition of 2 or more vowel sounds in words that are near to one another. They just need to be nearby. They don't have to be one after the other. Let's go back to the poem. So here's an example of assonance. the short A sound of sad, and it's picked up again in as. So sad as is an example of assonance. We can go down to the second stanza and see assonance carried over more than one line. So if you look at lines 7 and 8, we have cold, blow, and go. So the long O sound is carried over the first line of the stanza to the second line of the stanza. And then it's picked up again here in below and again in fro. Right, so now we have examples of rhyme, alliteration, and assonance. And you'll notice that the diction in this poem, the word choice, and the combination of alliteration, assonance, and repetition emphasizes soft sounds. Right? These are not harsh or hard sounds. They're very soft. And that constructs a kind of euphonic feeling. There's euphony in this poem. The sounds are pleasing to us to hear. And that would be the opposite of cacophony. Joyce did not employ cacophony, a harsh, discordant sound that might be jarring to the ear. And so we'll want to ask why, right? Why are these the sounds that we're getting in this particular poem? Well, let's look at what the poem says. Notice right away we have a lot of sea images, water images in the poem. And then the simile in line 3 and 4 compares the noise of the waters to the sadness of a seabird going out over the sea by himself. We also know that the water sound that the speaker is hearing continues all day and all night. So there's an ongoing sound of the water. There's a sadness to the sound of the water. And we begin to recognize that the tone is one of loneliness and sadness. Additionally, this feeling of loneliness and sadness that comes through the tone is constant, and it's a kind of monotone feeling. So now we begin to see that Joyce is using the aquatic images, the images of sea and water, to portray grief and sadness and loneliness. And I think that's why there isn't any cacophony in this poem, because you have a loneliness and a sadness, a solitude that's constant, but it's monotone, it's soft, and if he had employed cacophony, that would have been the opposite of this feeling. It would have been much more jarring. And you might ask, well, if this is a poem that is conveying the experience of grief or sadness or loneliness, how can we say that the sound is pleasing if euphony is pleasing? And so it may be that in an auditory way these sounds are pleasing. At the very least, they're not jarring or displeasing. But you might also think that in the experience of sadness or loneliness or grief, finding a parallel in the natural world might offer a type of solace or comfort. And if the speaker is finding in some way that solace, then it isn't that much of a stretch to think that there could be euphony in the poem. Finally, notice that the different types of imagery that occur are not equally spread out through the poem. All right, so we have the tactile image of the cold winds. We can feel the coldness. And we have the visual image that comes in the simile because we see the seabird. But the predominant type of imagery in this poem is auditory imagery. And that imagery is reinforced by the many sounds employed in the poem through the various techniques of rhyme, alliteration, assonance, and euphony.